My oldest sister, who's way older than me, is on the way. She's on what they call El Camino, and she's headed towards Santiago de Compostela, which is a pilgrimage site in Europe, in Spain actually. It's one of the most famous pilgrim walks in the history of Christendom. And she's starting in Lourdes and going to walk 500 miles over the next 4 weeks to celebrate her 25th anniversary of consecrating her life to Jesus Christ. So instead of getting married and have children, she's decided to give her life to be able to serve especially high school and college girls so that they can become young leaders in our world today based on gospel and Christ-like values. And so she's going on this pilgrimage. She started just a couple of days ago with my niece, my godchild, of course, Annie, and then this other girl, Megan Christ, and they're on this journey. And they just showed me some pictures. They're going through the Pyrenees Mountains. And one of the things that she had to think about is on this walk, on this way, you could only basically carry about 15 pounds. Now, I don't know if her purse ever got that light before. So she's having to select what it is she's supposed to be bringing. And it's an interesting question, isn't it? Twofold question. Are we on the way? And if we are on the way, what are we carrying? And so it's interesting because it unfolds and unpacks exactly what Mark starts this gospel with. You know, you heard Deacon Jim use the word villages of Caesarea Philippi, and that probably means nothing to most of us because who cares where that is. But the next phrase, Mark only uses this a couple times. It says, along the way. Mark does that just very few times. It's like this huge shout out of saying, Jesus is on the way. You know, it's like he is going somewhere. This is not just a guy that's randomly letting life pass by, but he is orientated. He has this GPS thing, and there is no rerouting in his life. He is focused, but at the same time compassionate and loving with all those who are in front of him. And so he's on the way. And this is the first time of 3 times in Mark where he says, what is the destination of this way? Where is it leading him? So thus, what is the training and the preparation to be able to get to the final destination? Well, it has everything to do with him being betrayed, with him being crucified, with him dying, and then rising on the 3rd day. And note, most of the saints would look at this passage and passages similar and recognize that the way to be a disciple, the way of following Jesus Christ, is this way. It's uncomfortable to think about. I don't think most of us will look at this gospel and say, yeah, this is going to make me inspired. But this is exactly what is the heart and at the battle of Christianity, is this very way. Are we on the way? And if we are on the way, what do we have in our knapsacks that we're walking with that help us to stay on the way and not get off of the way? You know, I was Googling yesterday because it just made me think of all these saints that took this gospel and said, if there's one part of Scripture I'm not going to move from, it's this one. And until I let this be my life, I'm not moving from it. And so I thought, what are the top 10 saints who have suffered? Like, who suffered the most of all of our saints? It'd be a good debate to have today instead of wondering if the Steelers could beat the Chiefs, to really see who are the top 10 saints who have suffered the most. And as I was doing this, my kitty cat, who comes in and inspires me sometimes, her name is Philomena, and she just meowed right at me. And I Google, I'm like, yeah, right. So I Google it, and you know what came up? This was a theologian from Mexico. Her name is Susana Gonzalez. And she said that the saint who suffered the most was Saint Philomena. And the cat just looked at me and walked away. She's like, I knew that. And I didn't know much about Philomena. I've always had great devotion to her because she was the patron saint of the patron saint of priests, St. John Maria Vianney. That was his go-to saint, was St. Philomena. Anyway, she only spent 37 years in jail. She was tried many times. The Roman emperor wanted her in marriage, and she would just say no. She had given her life over to Jesus and didn't want to be married. And so the emperor then would take her and whip her to death so all of her skin fell off. But yet the angels came and cured her. The emperor then thought this was some type of special person, so that he really wanted to marry her, and she refused again. So then she was thrown into the Tiber River with a rock around her neck and her arms tied back so she would drown to death, and the angels saved her again. So the emperor got really mad and just then had her sit below somewhere, and they just shot her with arrows. But that didn't do anything to her. It just made her suffer, but she was cured of that too. So then he said, well, now we're going to dip these arrows in like some type of a gas and then light her on fire. And that didn't do it either. So finally he got so frustrated, he just chopped her head off. So I was like, okay, my kitty cat could be right there. That could be one of the most the difficult ones. I don't know who it is. I always thought it was St. John de Brebeuf, because he was killed by the Iroquois and tortured for hours, endured stoning, slashing with knives, this red hot tomahawk, something or another, baptism of scalding water. He's burned at the stake. They ate his fingers, and just to kind of throw it all together, they ate his heart. So, this is kind of like, these are gross, these are guys and girls who really suffered a lot. And it's like, man. And so, there's all kinds of great saints who have done just heroic things, taking this gospel. Then there's like St. Augustine, who spent 40 years in just manic depression and loneliness. And so it's not just physical suffering, sometimes it's spiritual suffering and loneliness that can be a tremendous. And so, on Friday was the feast of the exaltation of the cross, followed by a great double header, Our Lady of Sorrows. And then as somebody was saying to me, Father, why are we reading a gospel about the cross? This should only be something we read during Lent. I'm like, that's the problem. So then we get the trilogy, which is just this gospel, which just is a great way to just realize, wow, these last 3 days have been a tremendous triduum of dedication to a theme that most of us can't stand thinking about, which is self-denial as the absolute way to live out our Christian faith. St. Paul would write to the Galatians, echoing our motto at St. Simon and Jude, Alive with Christ. He says, I've been crucified with Christ. And the life I live now is not my own. Christ is living in me. And then we hear old man Simeon, echoing kind of why we celebrate Our Lady of Sorrows, prophesying to our dear Mother Mary that a sword will pierce through her own soul so that the hearts of many may be revealed. And so definitely suffering is the sure way to follow Christ. Mary shows us this. Paul shows us this. All the Hall of Fame human beings called saints show us this. And Jesus Christ doesn't just tell us this, but he demonstrates it, which is why the crucifix is such a key symbol of the way. Unfortunately, many times we see crucifixes and we treat them as jewelry, which is fine. But could you imagine in a first century context to hear Jesus say that the way is to deny yourself, to take up your cross, and to follow me? In the first century, crucifixion was the most brutal form of death. You'd be completely stripped. You would be totally humiliated. And then you'd be thrown on a cross to basically drown to death in your own. So, it's not like a really nice thing to think about, or something that you would think of as a jewelry piece at the time. Now, I can understand why, because it's a blessing. But it's a little bit different if you think about it from the first century Jewish context. It's a little bit like Jesus telling us to deny ourselves and ascend to the electric chair, and then to follow him. And so it kind of leads all of us to this threefold challenge. Are we on the way? Are we willing to be in that way that Jesus is asking us? And he says three things: deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Saint Therese, this just little girl in France, is just living in the middle of, the beautiful countryside of France. She had this way of denying herself. She would use what they call these sacrifice beads. And every day, her and her sister would look through and see how many times they could do a sacrifice in the day. Maybe it'd be opening up a door for a sibling. Maybe it'd be instead of having cream in the coffee, they would abstain from cream in the coffee. Maybe instead of watching the Steeler game, maybe watching the Steeler game would be a sacrifice. Different things like, well, they didn't have the Steelers then, but they had other forms of sacrifice that they could. And so every day there are just these little details which help kind of build that. And at the end of each night, they'd see how many beads they were able to get through of just doing simple, everyday little sacrifices out of love for your neighbor, out of love for Jesus. And many times nobody knew what they were doing. And those little ways are kind of like those little spiritual muscles that help us work out on earth that beautiful walk towards this amazing destination that absolutely is filled with a lot of sacrifice. And then it's to take up your cross, which we just heard, get into the electric chair. It's kind of a crazy thing to think about. Why would Jesus Christ ask us to humiliate ourselves to the point of being executed by the state? And it is a horrific thought, but it is a thought that Jesus says, in order to be my student, we have to be willing to risk everything. And finally, he says, follow me. It's the imitation of Christ. If it's not enough to be in self-denial and offer yourself by taking up the cross, the final thing is follow me. Maybe that's why there's so few saints in our world, so few people willing to follow the way. I know for me it sounds repugnant. It doesn't sound like something I want to wake up to every single day. It's like, okay, maybe during Lent I'll think about a couple sacrifices, but it's definitely not the daily way that I would choose. And so it's a challenge for us in the world that we live in today. When Jesus says this, what's the reaction of the first pope? What's the reaction of the hierarchy? It is not one of total acceptance. In fact, Jesus condemns the reaction of the hierarchy in front of this. And he condemns what Peter says. He rebukes them. And he actually calls him Satan. And it makes you wonder, if Jesus would rebuke the hierarchy, a pope at that time, what would he say to some of our church leadership at this time? You start to think about, what is the proper reaction in front of innocence being destroyed? It's not hide behind canon law and do PR moves. It's absolutely like a good parent, like a good mom or dad would do. This is not permissible. You don't go through some PR thing and all these legal stuff. It is get behind me, Satan. Satan means adversary. It's like calling somebody a Baltimore Ravens fan or a Philadelphia Flyer fan. You can't imagine. It's repugnant. There couldn't be anything worse than that. And Peter, who was just elevated to be this great leader in our church, is absolutely challenged by Jesus to be that bishop, that father-like figure. Not some effeminate man trying to just get off on some liturgical stuff and to be a part of some group or club. He challenges him to absolutely deny himself, to take up his cross, and to actually follow him. And so today, when you think about it, you think of some of the great saints who have actually called out. You hear it like St. Peter Damian, who was a doctor of the church. And he would say this to the clergy at his time. This is 1,000 years ago. For God's sake, why do you damnable sodomites pursue the heights of ecclesiastical dignity with such fiery ambition? Who can expect the flock to prosper when its shepherd has sunk so deep into the bowels of the devil? It's these doctors of the church called, and it's a constant call for all of us, but most especially for those who are in leadership positions in our church, to realize that we are here to sacrifice ourselves as good parents would for their children, to the extreme of even dying on a cross. And not for that probably one of the most famous spiritual writers of all time, you know what his nickname was? The Cross. Pretty cool, Can you imagine people just saying, hey, what's going on? The Cross. That's what this guy was. He was just the Cross. They would just call him the Cross. That's such a cool nickname, He didn't have all these other nicknames. Just the Cross. His name was St. John of the Cross. And what St. John of the Cross did was he took this gospel today and said, this is the heart of what true spirituality is. Spirituality is not some type of yoga position or breathing. Spirituality is about centering your life in Christ, the sacrificial nature of the way. Another of self-denial, of taking up your cross, and of imitating Jesus Christ. And so St. John of the Cross, who is really the father of real spirituality, would talk about this way, which is of self-denial, being the very way to Jesus Christ. And so perhaps that is a good person to be hearing from today in this time that we live in which he says that the way is self-denial. That's where true spirituality is. It seeks distasteful things instead of fruitful. It inclines itself to suffer rather than consolation. For God's sake, it looks for dryness rather than sweet communication. This is the way to God. It's not some method of prayer or some type of spiritual ecstasy. Only one thing is needed, as Jesus would say, self-denial, to give ourselves up to suffering. And as St. John of the Cross would say, even to the point of the nada, self-annihilation. And so my dear sister is going on a 500-mile journey. I tried to do that once with some priests. You know what happened to me? I ended up renting a car and spending a week in a vineyard. I never made beyond that vineyard. Maybe I need to learn from my oldest sister, who's way older than me, that the true journey is about taking up a very small package of things in this world, but staying focused on the way. And maybe by carrying sacrifice beads, I won't look for luxury but self-denial, and find that that's where the face of Jesus will appear the most. Are we on the way, the path of self-denial towards sainthood?